So where do we have people participating from today? Australia, Binghamton, New York. Oh no, is it Binghamton, UK? Probably. Germany, Tennessee in the US. Oh, New York. It is New York. Okay. I forgot that. Where else? Did I say Germany? Yeah, where from? Exactly. Where are you now? Illinois. Oh, wait, anyone else from Illinois? None of our presenters today, right? Got another Illinoisian in the house. Baton Rouge. More Illinois being represented. Charlotte. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. It's 3:30, and so I just wanted to thank you guys again. Today is the final webcast for this session. Of course, the next time that we'll be seeing each other will be at the Academy of Management in Anaheim. Thank you so much for participating in all these sessions. I just want to add a few things. One is that I think most everything should be posted on the website right now. So all of the things all of the readings are still there, and I've been posting all the slides. All the slides for the session will be posted by the end of today. If you'd like to access those will be up there. I want to give a warm welcome to our 4 presenters today. We're going to start with Jen Green. Jen is a doctoral student in industrial organizational psychology at George Mason University. She studies selection, statistics, qualitative methods, let's give her a warm welcome. We are also going to be hearing from Aaron Hill. Aaron is an associate professor at Oklahoma State. He's also the William S. Spears, Chair of Business Administration. He studies executives and also boards of directors. Jen, can you hear me? All right. Do you see the little, you see at the top where it says Red and Help, and then it says Meeting, and then it says Layouts, Pods, Audio, and then it's got a speaker button and then the microphone button? Can you click on the microphone button and choose Connect My Audio? Oh, it's green. Let's see what Davis has to say. It might make sense for us to, yeah, let's go to Erin. Erin, if you're ready, and I'm sorry, and Davis, if you could try to help her out, that would be fantastic.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, I will get my slides up. Which I think I can do by, okay, there we go. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. Hopefully I'll share a few insights here into the publishing process with respect to responding to reviewers. My slides are up, and if you have questions, you can certainly contact me personally. I'll gladly help any way. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so sorry about that. So I just started out with basically some opening caveats, okay, which just acknowledges that this process can be frustrating. It's hard to deal with the criticism, but there's definitely reason for optimism. Okay, and so my goal is basically just to summarize, really, my thoughts and those of others, really, publications on taking advantage of this opportunity. Okay? So as our focus is on methods response, the first part of that entails methods. And for a first step, and this is by Siebert, I'm trying to summarize others' observations here, is really do not trust reviewers to see the potential, have a best possible method submission. And what does best possible look like? There's an editorial by Zhang and Shah and AMJ, and the sites are at the end of this paper. Okay? But really the best possible methods will be complete, clear, and credible. All right? The goal is to have the methods complete, have them clear so that the reader, or in this case a reviewer, understands what you're doing and establish some credibility. Okay? So what does that mean? Okay, there's kind of a few things summarized here from Zhang and Shah, but really what we want to try and do is explain what we did, why we did it for each decision. That includes the use of data, the measures that we selected, as well as the analyses that we conducted. Okay? Once we explain it, we need to justify what we did, both with theory and empirical tests. So for example, this is why we would do it in theory. This is what the empirical test says. So something like, for example, fixed effects versus random effects. This is why we would choose fixed effects. This is what, for example, the Hausman test says with respect to our analytical approach. Okay. Where possible, conduct and report additional tests. For example, if your model is robust to fixed and random effects, that's something that, if you report, gives you additional credibility that your methods are complete, clear, and credible. Okay? And this is specifically an emphasis with SMJ recently, but interpret empirical and practical significance. And be reasonable and open to limitations. Right? Every data set, every measurement approach, every analysis has some limitation. Just be open and reasonable to that, okay? And open and reasonable with respect to your interpretations. And these three approaches, being complete, clear, and credible, are really designed to avoid issues that are common in rejections. So the second part is a response. And responding to reviewers means both an accomplishment in that you got the R&R and additional work. Okay? So it's kind of a two-part thing, adjusting the paper and writing a response. So for this, I tried to summarize some possible steps to a response. The first step really is it takes a little time. Okay? So celebrate. It's an accomplishment. There's so much failure in this field, and it's something that can be frustrating because the best possible submission really is, hey, you get more work. It's very rare that you would have something accepted without some type of revision requested. Okay? So take a little time, celebrate, cool off over the critiques. I know that when I read reviewer responses, I often think they didn't get it or they missed this. So it's definitely frustrating. But to the extent that you can cool off and stay positive, reviewers are just doing their job. And it's self-actualization. Okay? If you say, well, I didn't do my job good enough, and I'm going to be positive about this, it can't help your attitude. And then it may help to continually ask yourself, how do I improve on the 3 C's? The reviewers may be dead wrong, but at the same point in time, it may signal that you weren't clear, you weren't complete, or you weren't credible. So if you kind of take that emotion out of it, maybe taking some time will help. Second, prioritize the comments. Okay? There's kind of 2 goals here in mind. First, make sure that's the 3 C's. We want to get this right. We want it to be complete. We want it to be clear. We want it to be credible. But second, practically speaking, we want to get past the gatekeepers. So we may need to appease reviewer curiosity and concern. Okay, not all comments are beneficial, but that doesn't mean we can be defensive because C goals above. We just want to be complete, clear, and credible. And then we want to get through the gate. And being defensive is not going to help us do that. Okay? Then lastly, when you're unclear on a comment, appropriately ask the editor. Right? It may be that, and I'm sorry this keeps scrolling up and down. I don't know if that's something I'm doing or someone on the other end, so I apologize for that. But I'm on the slide with prioritized comments. Okay? You may be able to email the editor directly and ask for clarity. It's better than misinterpretation, but make sure you do that appropriately. Okay? Spend your time crafting a nice email to the editor. Make sure that you're clear in why there's confusion, what you don't understand. We don't want to waste their time or signal that you don't understand what's going on. So use that rarely, but it's better than misinterpreting and getting it wrong. Okay? Third, develop a plan. And this comes mostly from Bono and McNamara. The first thing you should probably do is try and prioritize the big comments first. If you have something that's majorly wrong or that a reviewer has a particular issue with, if you can fix the small changes but not the big one, the small changes may be for naught. It may be a waste of time. So put the big comments first. There's not necessarily a way to size the comments, but again, go back to the 3 C's. What will make this more complete, more clear, more credible? Factor in if one edit, for example, if something you have to change in another part of the paper, like the theory, changes your 3 C's. Usually the editor should come first, so maybe prioritize their comments over reviewers because they're the ultimate decision maker. And you may want to read between the lines on wording. For example, reviewers may use words like, I emphasize this, or I suggest this, or this is a major concern, or they may just be stating it out of curiosity, at which point it's a lesser concern. And so there's no one way to do that, but try and size things so that you can now have an approach. And then set tasks and a timeline. If you have co-authors, you want to agree on that. But R&Rs have deadlines, and managing that impression is one of the parts to getting that first thing through a reviewer door. If you're consistently late or you're incomplete in an area, that may be a signal of quality to the editors and reviewers. Okay? At the same time, if you send it back within a week's time, unless it's a very, very minor change, it may signal that you didn't give their comments appropriate consideration or put appropriate time into editing the paper. Okay? Then execute the plan. Okay? Address each comment. If a reviewer took time to write the comment, it means that they had something that twinged their interest. So definitely respond to each comment, and generally do this on a point-by-point basis just to make sure you're thorough. Okay? And this is a hand-in-hand and iterative process with the letter. So as you're responding to the letter, you're going to change the manuscript and identify where you do that in the manuscript. Okay? So hopefully it's pretty straightforward. As an aside then, when you're writing the response letter, this is a conversation with someone that you like. It's easy to become defensive about this. I know that sometimes I want to, vent or tell a reviewer why I think they're wrong. And I'm saying this keeps going up and down, but I'm on a side response letter. But consider this as a conversation with someone you like. If someone you like asks you a question, you would usually respond to that question. Okay. Secondly, don't debate. It's not your opinion versus their opinion. Use the 3 C's. You want to get this right. Okay? So you want it to be clear, concise, and credible. It's not an opinion that fixed effects are better than random effects. You want to have some type of opinion, neutral fact, right? So clear, concise, credible, not an opinion. And do not start a new tangent or argument. If they ask you about your use of fixed effects, don't talk about something unrelated to that. Okay? Attempt to make a constructive edit to the paper for each question. It could be a robustness test that, okay, you asked for this control, but I really don't understand why you would include it. But to the extent that you can show it's robust to that, that's good. Or maybe you can note the limitation, or you can clarify and say, oh, I didn't explain that measure well enough, or I didn't explain why we did this. So try to make a constructive edit. If nothing else, just to show the reviewers that you're being responsive and cognizant. 3, help the reviewer out and the editor by noting specifically what you did in the paper. Say, on this page, we did this. Reviewers are people too. They're constrained for time. I know that sometimes I have other things going and I'm like, oh, this review's due tomorrow. Okay, and I'm reading what the authors did. To the extent that they can help show me that they addressed my concern, it helps me as a reviewer. So it may frame this in the right thing. Okay. And Paula brought this here a point. Some of you may not see this. Yes, the reviewer may not be as passionate about your research topic as you are. So the R&R is a huge opportunity to better inform them about what you're doing. So that goes back to that clarity. And then 4, the letter should have an appropriate tenor. Be appreciative but not excessive. If you're going way over the top in thankfulness, it can become disingenuous or maybe be perceived as that. Okay? If you're rejected, carefully consider before contacting the editor. I've never contacted the editor. I've heard of people who have, but I've also heard from some prominent scholars that they tried it and then they basically started a long-standing war with this particular editor. Okay? So it rarely works because you're basically highlighting an error potentially that the editor made. So if they're wrong and you're right, you're still just highlighting their oversight. So be very, very careful on considering that. It's a long career in a small world. There's other avenues for that paper. Okay? Or maybe it's one of the rare ones that works. I'm just saying be careful. 5, make changes to improve your paper. It's a long career in a small world. You'd be surprised how many times you'll see a paper that you previously reviewed. It seems like you wouldn't, but if you review for, say, AMJ and SMJ, and a paper was rejected at AMJ, and then you get the same paper, a week later or a day later at SMJ, it's like, well, they didn't really make any changes. That's not been the best possible submission. I usually write to the editor and say, well, I already reviewed this paper for AMJ, but other reviewers may not. So be cognizant of that. Again, it's a small world, and that may not be your best possible submission if you don't make any constructive changes after a rejection. So final points, learn from others. Like Paula said, some great advice from other mentors or from your experience in the field or from other co-authors. Okay? You may want to have a friendly review. It's common to send out a friendly review of the paper. So maybe send out a friendly review of the R&R as you're first learning. Like, hey, here's how we responded. Is this appropriate? Certainly protect the integrity of the process. Ask the person before you would send them the thing. But when I was first starting out, I sent one of my first R&Rs to one of my mentors and said, hey, here's what I wrote. What do you think? And it helped me in terms of reframing some things that they thought maybe were problematic. So use your mentors to help you in the process. Observe the norms in the field and practice and learn from feedback. Nothing too enlightening there, but it's a craft to write a good response. So the more we can learn from others and the more we can learn from experience, the better we are. And then finally, have fun, work hard, and believe in yourself. It's possible. Certainly getting back to that Ferris point at the first. So hope this was helpful. I look forward to any feedback, questions, whether online here or offline. So please feel free to type them in here. If we don't get to all of your comments here, please feel free to contact me directly. I'm more than happy to try and help. Looks like a few questions are, says some people are typing, so I'll give it a minute here before Chris passes it on to either herself or Jen. Looks like we have time for about 2 to 3 questions. Paula had a comment from earlier, no question. Okay, thank you, Paula. I appreciate your comment. Definitely true that we often probably overestimate how much the reviewer may know our area or care about our area. So to the extent that we can inform them as clearly as possible, it may help the process. You may get a methods reviewer who maybe doesn't understand your research area, or someone in your research area who doesn't understand your method. So it's definitely an opportunity to try and clearly, credibly inform them. Okay, I have a question here that says, how frequently do you really contact the editor? Sometimes reviewer comments are unclear, but I wonder if the editor understands them. So asking the editor may put them in an awkward position. I have only contacted an editor one time, and that was to get clarity on what he or she wrote, because usually they summarize what they would like you to do. And in that instance, it helped because what I said is, you wrote X, I'm having trouble understanding if you meant Y or Z. Here's why I say that. Um, and they were able to actually schedule a phone call with me and try and explain what they did. So I've only done it one time, but it definitely did help. And that was a suggestion that I took from one of the papers cited. Second question, I was given the advice to keep it really simple with reported methods under the assumption that you hardly will be rejected because of lack of analysis. So my opinion is you're generally rejected for two large things, or there are two large fatal flaws. One is poor methods, whether that's measures that mismatch or poor analyses. So I try and be very thorough with my methods and say this is what we did and why. The other is having a research topic or framing that doesn't articulate any advancement to knowledge. So that's kind of outside the scope of this conversation. But in terms of your methods, you can keep it simple so long as you explain what you did and why. For example, we selected this data set because of this. We surveyed because of this. We used this measure because of this. We used this analysis because of this. And that may be more common in more advanced approaches, but for example, even if you're using SEM, you may want to say, well, we chose SEM over linear regression because of this. So you can keep it simple, but I do think lack of explanation can often contribute to a reviewer thinking the paper is poor quality when you may have done everything. If it's unclear to them what exactly you did, that leads to lack of credibility. It's not clear, so then therefore it's not credible in the 3 C's. So to the extent you can be clear and credible, I think that will happen. Next question. Some journal outlets have an option to select reviewers. How often do you think about it personally, and how useful is that system? The journals that I typically target do not allow you to select reviewers. However, you get the opportunity to send a letter to the editor when you submit, so you may be able to signal some appropriate reviewers. And I've done that before and said, okay, here's what my topic is. Here are 3 or 4 people who I think would be good reviewers. Whether they end up as the reviewers or not, I don't know. But for example, if I was doing something in CEO personality research, there's 10 people in that area that are consistently publishing in the outlets that I would like to publish in. So I may send to the editor that here are some people I think would be good reviewers. Also, I tell people who has done a friendly review for me so that they don't send it to that reviewer. Chris said she appreciates when people recommend reviewers in the cover letter, and she's an AE. So it's definitely appropriate. I definitely do think about it personally because if there's someone researching something very similar to what I am, they'll understand the context, they'll understand the contribution, they'll understand the methodology. So for example, in CEO research, maybe we use proxies that wouldn't be appropriate in OB research. So I wouldn't want that to go to an OB methodologist who would say, well, why didn't you survey CEOs? When a TMT researcher would say, well, there's these problems with doing that. So I would try and signal that. I think that's it for questions for me. I'll certainly stick around after to answer others, or certainly feel free to contact me directly as well. Unless there are other last questions.
Testing out my microphone. Is this working? This is Jen. Woohoo! All right, great. then should I get started? Okay, awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for dealing with the technical difficulties. My name's Jen Green. As Chris mentioned, I'm a doctoral student at George Mason University. And today, in order to provide advice on how to respond to reviewers, I'm going to present some results from a paper that was recently published in ORM by myself and Scott Tony Dandel and Jose Cortina. So to provide a brief overview, oops, what happened? Okay, I think something's going wrong with the slides, but it seems like I can't share the slides, but whoever put up the slides before, it seems like I can't scroll through them either. So I'll just ask whoever can slide to just move when I move on. So to just provide a brief, so slide 2 is good, to provide a brief study overview. So in the study we coded 69 manuscripts submitted to Journal of Business and Psychology. We didn't actually code the manuscripts, but we coded the editors and reviewers' letters for those manuscripts. So we looked at their comments and specifically looked at research method and statistical comments. And the purpose was to provide insight into the peer review process and ultimately give authors like yourselves guidance into your submissions. So going to slide 3, please. To briefly summarize our methods, here's a figure that basically reflects our coding approach. So basically we took the editors and reviewers' comments and we coded them directly for what the text said. Then we grouped that into second order focus coding where the codes were similar and grouped them together. And then we grouped those into overarching sort of themes or families, and that resulted in things like factor analysis. And if we go to slide 4, we can see the other sort of families, and you'll see that they reflect common statistical and research method analyses. And so in the remaining slides and the rest of this presentation, I'll discuss a few of these topics and findings that we went through. However, just to mention that the paper covers more topics than I have for today, but I'll talk about a few that were particularly relevant. I'll go through findings, recommendations, and there's some exemplary quotes in here as well. So on slide 5 here, starting with control variables. So with regards to control variables, what reviewers and editors were saying, we found that, as may be expected, reviewers were asking authors to include more control variables. But also we were finding that reviewers were asking for authors to justify the control variables that they did include. And so while we found that editors and reviewers mentioned the lack of control variables more than they mentioned having too many control variables or too many unnecessary control variables, we found that the editors did reject relatively even percentages of manuscripts that raised either issue. If we go to slide 6, please. So we can see that these findings reflect a current debate in the literature. So should we worry about omitted variables, so the lack of variables, or should we worry about too many variables, too many control variables? And so in order to appeal to both sides of the debate, the recommendation for authors would be to theoretically support the control variables that you do include, but also have reasons as to why you didn't include other control variables that may seem like obvious control variables or ones that you may not have thought of. Just try in your study design, I guess, to think of other control variables and why you didn't include them. And so having that will help you prepare for reviewer comments if they mention control variables that you did not include. Okay, moving on to slide 7. So another topic was common method variance. So briefly, common method variance is when you have similarities in your measurement methods, and this produces biased estimates of reliability and validity, and results in sort of inaccurate estimates about the relationships among your variables. So in our study, we found that most of the comments regarding CMV were about self-report data, so authors were using all self-report data methods. And we may traditionally think that CMV is a fatal flaw, and certainly we saw quotes that reflected this. But we also saw quotes that reflected another side of the argument in the literature, that there's researchers who have realized that common method variance is not always necessarily a problem. And so this too was reflected in the letters. And though it may not be a fatal flaw when comparing the rejection rate of manuscripts whose comments contained CMV issues and those that did not have issues with CMV, the rejection rate was higher for manuscripts whose editors or reviewers commented on common method variants. So moving on to slide 8, please. So to approach this, we recommend a couple steps. So ideally in your research design, you would avoid problems that you may have later with common method variants. So spread the data collection over time, collect data from different sources. But if CMV is unavoidable, then be sure that you defend your method in your manuscript. And so be aware of instances where CMV may not be an issue. You can provide these citations in the manuscript or in your responses to reviewers. And finally, if you want, and you should, use appropriate statistical remedies for issues with common method variants. However, as a disclaimer, which is why the star is there, if editors and reviewers find issues with CMV in your study design, these post hoc analyses may not be enough for them to not reject the paper. Okay, and then moving to slide 9, thank you. So another topic that was really frequently raised by reviewers and editors dealt with measurement. And so these comments ranged from the choice of the constructs, so the theoretical reasoning that you might find in the introduction, and the definition of the concepts and constructs, but then also the operational of the construct and demonstration of convergent and discriminant validity. And that deals with methods such as factor analyses and SEM to demonstrate these convergent and discriminant validity. So moving on to slide 10, as far as what to do with regards to measurement. So first of all, choose your measures wisely. So try to theoretically support the measures that you choose, and if you don't have as much theoretical support, at least have really compelling empirical support for the measures that you chose to reflect your constructs. And also be sure to establish the appropriateness of your measures. So demonstrate the convergent and discriminant validity of the measures that you do have. And one thing to consider is CFA or EFA more appropriate? And also a couple reviewers raised in their comments when authors would do both the CFA and EFA on the same data set, it doesn't show anything different about or give you any additional information when you do both tests on the same data set. So don't do that. And then moving on to slide 11. Finally, there were some data analytic errors that were brought up by editors and reviewers in their comments. And so these ranged from things such as you should do random coefficient modeling, or specifically HLM, when accounting for nesting of your data, or use SEM to account for highly related dependent variables. And I guess the good thing with these was that reviewers notice and recognize that these issues can be addressed with post hoc analyses. So it may not be make or break for your manuscript. But if you do recognize that your data fit any of these characteristics, it's better off to do these statistical analyses up front prior to submitting. And that's all I have for you
We
today.
probably
So
have time
thank you.
for about two or three questions for Jen. If there are some questions you'd like to type in.
Thanks, Paula, for the question. Yes, it's already published. It's on the ORM website. And if anyone has difficulty getting it, then just be sure to email me and I can send you a copy too. Thanks, Jose. Okay, so the question of more exotic methods. That's a good question. I don't know what would qualify as an exotic method. I think we did find that sophisticated statistical analyses in general seem to be the things that were recommended. But I'm not sure if we didn't really notice any trends as far as the less well-known methods, but it did seem like comprehensive analyses were more suggested than obviously sort of piecemeal analyses. So if a paper had both mediation and moderation in it and they didn't test them together, then the reviewers may have commented that we want a mediated moderation or moderated mediation model to be tested as well. So I think in general the overall themes was more comprehensive analyses, more sophisticated analyses when appropriate. Yep, no problem. Okay, thanks, everyone.
At this point, then we can probably turn it over to Elaine Hollinsby. And I'm not sure if you guys heard my introduction of her, but I would like to just briefly tell you that she's a professor at the University of Cincinnati. She's also the doctoral program coordinator. She's associate editor at the Academy of Management Journal, and she studies identity and emotion. So, Elaine, if we can turn it over to you, that would be fantastic. In the interest of time, should we move on to James at this point? Okay. Okay, well, in that case, let's move on to James LeBreton. Again, I'm not sure if you heard my introduction of him, but he is a professor at Penn State University. He's also the editor of the journal Organizational Research Methods. He studies personality and also research methods. So if we can give a warm welcome to James, I would appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? All righty. So thank you, Chris, for that nice introduction and for the chance to share my thoughts on responding to reviewers. I'm going to echo many of the same things that the other presenters have said. I did take a slightly different tact when I went about preparing my talk, and I thought about things through kind of several different lenses. So as Chris mentioned, I've had the opportunity to serve as the editor of a journal. So I've thought about, you know, how to respond to reviewers through the eyes of an editor, but then also I've had experience reviewing and how people respond to the comments and suggestions that I make, and then also how I've approached it in the past, at least, as an author. I think, and then I have a few suggestions, just kind of general suggestions for you all as well. I think if there's anything we can all agree on, it's the peer review system is an imperfect process, and it's definitely going to be like that because it relies on subjective human judgment. And so we're always going to struggle with trying to come up with the optimal way to evaluate scholarship. But it's a system that we have, and although it's imperfect, it is one that affords us great opportunity to reflect on what we've done and to seek input and counsel from other experts in the field. So as an editor, and I'm sure other folks on the panel would agree who've done editing work, I'm in the business of trying to find papers to publish. I'm trying to track down really interesting papers that I can accept for publication at the journal that I edit. I'm not in the business of rejecting papers left and right. I'm trying to find really, really good things to publish. And so one of the things that I think as an author, as you set out about thinking about your work as well as how to revise your work to better fit with journals, you can think a little bit about what's going to be the factors that are going to guide the decisions to invite you to revise your paper or to reject it. Each journal's different. At ORM, the desk rejection rate is about 30%. So roughly a third of the papers that get submitted I don't even send out for peer review. I typically do get input from an associate editor on the manuscript if I'm not 100% sure. I do get a second set of eyes on things sometimes. On balance, across all the manuscripts that come in, I would say the rejection rate is around 85%, but the acceptance rate then is about 15%. I just got done telling you I'm in the business of accepting papers, not rejecting them, so why the overwhelmingly large rejection rate? Well, there's different reasons that papers get rejected and different reasons why they get invited for revision. If you get invited for revision, that's a really good thing. When you think that a third of the papers that come in, at least at my journal, don't even get reviewed, if your paper gets off my desk and out for review, that's a really good thing because now you've already made it into that good group of papers. If it gets just rejected, almost always it's going to be due to a lack of fit. And as a methodological journal, we strive to publish methodological papers and papers that advance our research methods and our tools. And so sometimes I'll get things that are pure stats but don't really have any connection to management, or I might get something that has nothing new in it. It's just a factor analysis of a job satisfaction survey, but it happens to be from data in another country or something like that. And it might have a very interesting substantive story to tell, but it's not really advancing methodology. So I think one way to maximize the likelihood that you get invited for that R&R is to make sure that you're submitting your papers to the journals that are the right outlets for them. So if you're not citing that journal or similar types of journals in your paper, it's probably because that journal and similar journals are not the right outlet. When it comes to a paper that goes out for review and we get reviews on it and the associate editor or the editor decides to reject it, it's almost always for similar reasons as a desk rejection, in the sense that it could be due to limited contribution. And I can't remember, I think it might have been Aaron who was saying, you want to make sure that your research questions are interesting to not only yourself, but to your broader audience. And you want to make sure that you create a compelling story around your research and what you're doing and why you're doing it and what the contribution is. The other reason that papers will get rejected is that there'll be some sort of fatal flaw. There'll be something wrong with the paper that is just insurmountable. And so those are when we see the papers getting rejected. If you get an R&R, that's awesome, and you should be really excited about it, and you should pursue it. Basically, what an R&R communicates, or at least my perspective as an editor, is that this is a really neat idea, and I think there's some potential here for this paper to make an important contribution, but there's something missing. I need more information. I need some questions answered. I need some additional analyses run or some additional comparisons conducted. And so if you want to maximize that R&R chance, make sure that you're framing it correctly for the right journal, and that you've done a really bang-up job in the first few pages of explaining why this paper is really, really important and why this work is something that should be published. If I take off my editor cap and I put on my straight-up reviewer cap, I think it's helpful for you to kind of look at this exercise through the lens of a reviewer. I don't like reviewing. I really don't. I do reviewing, I do editing because I think it's an important service to the field, and because I enjoy the editing process of trying to help authors who have a really neat idea get that idea packaged in such a way that it is accessible to the audience of the journal and is something that can be implemented in the field. But reviewing just for the sake of reviewing, I don't enjoy it. I'm busy just like you all are busy, and I'm doing my best to provide helpful and constructive feedback. I'm not compensated or paid for the reviews that I write, and I'm certainly not an expert on every topic. And so part of what that means is I don't necessarily expect that the authors of the manuscript or my editor or the other reviewers on a manuscript are going to necessarily agree with everything that I have to say. I don't pretend to have the answers to everything. My job is to try to provide input and feedback and counsel to the editor about kind of what the contribution of the manuscript is relative to the potential downside of the manuscript, the limitations or the flaws. And so in all the reviews I write, I always say, here's what I got out of your paper. Here are some potential limitations. These may or may not be limitations, but from my perspective, they struck me as potential problems. And so I would like you to try to address those. And oftentimes reviewers come back and say, nope, you misunderstood, or authors come back and say, nope, you misunderstood. This is what we were trying to do here. And if you look at it through that lens, you can see that this is really not a problem. I think a lot of reviewers are like that. They don't necessarily think that they're right. they're trying their best to kind of connect the dots and help the editor make an informed decision about your research. Finally, when I think about the R&R process and trying to deal with getting that R&R over the hurdle, I have two kind of author perspectives. So one is a naive author perspective. And when I was younger and more naive, I would say, oh, gee, all my ideas are really important contributions. And you know, why would I do a research project if I didn't think it was going to be an important contribution? And so I'm going to go do my research projects, and I'm going to test those ideas, and I'm going to send my results to great journals. And clearly, only a fool would fail to see the wonderful contribution in my work. And even if I were to encounter such a fool at even a great journal, I'm sure that I will at least get a free review from this process, right? I'll send it to a great journal, and I'll have a great editorial board look at it. A wiser perspective, or one that I guess grown into over time, is that even though we might like to think that all of our ideas are great, some are good and some are less so. And it's hard sometimes for us to reflect on our own work and discriminate the really good ideas from the weaker ideas. I have a personal philosophy that I'm going to test my ideas and send my strongest test of my strongest ideas to the strongest journals. And so I don't, as an author, I don't want to send a paper that I don't think is really a strong paper to a great outlet, because I don't really want to waste the reviewer's time or the editor's time. There's different schools of thought on that, but I can say as an editor, when I get something that comes in that's really not that strong, I tend to put that in the desk reject pile. So I think you can get a reputation both ways, you know, as really submitting only your best work to the best journals, and hopefully you'll have a really high hit rate when you do that. But you don't want to have I don't think you want to get a reputation of just submitting, you know, a paper to any journal, independent of kind of the fit or the strength of the ideas that are being tested. When I look on the papers that I've had rejected, I would say probably 2/3 of the time, half the time, I've misjudged the magnitude of my contribution. It was one of the earlier comments that was made about, you know, how you get really excited about your own research, but not about, it's hard sometimes to get reviewers excited about your research. Well, of course we're excited about our research. We wouldn't be doing it if we weren't excited about it. But just because we're excited about it doesn't mean that we have a realistic perspective on, is this really important? And so I would say personally as an author, probably 2/3 of the times my stuff's rejected, it's because I just didn't gauge the contribution correctly, and thus I miscalibrated and maybe sent my work to the wrong outlet. I would say the other 1/3 of the time I was spot on correct with my contribution, but I dropped the ball as an author, and I failed to explain my contribution and frame my contribution in a way that was convincing to the editor or to the reviewers. Very, very rarely you will run into a reviewer or an editor who is just being unreasonable or they're just being a jerk. Most people are doing their best, and they're trying to help, and they're trying to provide constructive feedback. Very, very rarely would I say I've had a paper rejected because it was just because somebody was unreasonable or they were just being mean. Most of the time it's a poor fit, or I misjudged the contribution, or I just haven't done a really good job packaging and communicating my ideas. So in terms of a few suggestions, when it comes to responding to an invitation to revise and resubmit, I would say you should do these things. You should accept the invitation, even if it's a very risky R&R. I've only published a handful of articles in the Journal of Applied Psychology, and every single article that I've ever had published there, the first round of reviews was described as this is a very risky revise and resubmit, or a high-risk revise and resubmit. I'm sure someone has gotten a moderate risk or a low-risk revise and resubmit, but I haven't stumbled upon that opportunity yet. they're always going to be risky. They're always going to be challenging. And so don't allow yourself to get discouraged or overwhelmed if you get the reviews back and they say, we want to do an R&R, but boy, look at all these things that you have to do. That's okay. Just walk away from it for a week, come back to it with fresh eyes, and start tackling the revision. I think this might have been another comment Aaron made, was respond to every concern. I mean, I just copy and paste the decision letter into a Word document, and then I go in and I respond to every single comment that was made. But you obviously want to place greater weight on specific concerns that may have been noted or emphasized in the decision letter of the editor. As an author and as a reviewer and as an editor, I think you should incorporate as many of the constructive and good and helpful suggestions as possible. And I think you should feel free to respectfully disagree with problematic suggestions. You want to pick your battles. You don't want to disagree and get argumentative with a reviewer and go point by point, nitpicking the responses. But if there's important points that come up and you just simply do not believe that the reviewer is correct, I think it's okay not to revise your manuscript. The manuscript is yours. You're the author of the manuscript, not the reviewer. It's your job to write the article. It's their job to critique it. And so if you think that you're right and they're wrong, that means it's incumbent upon you as the author to really dig down deep and write in a very clear way, like Aaron said, why your approach is the correct one. It needs to be respectful and not argumentative, but your job isn't necessarily to incorporate every single comment that a reviewer makes. At least that's not my opinion. If you have questions, absolutely you should seek clarification from an associate editor or an editor. I would much rather provide, when I put on my editor cap, I'd much rather be able to provide input to authors before they set about the revision to clarify things than to have them revise the paper, submit it, have it rejected, and then have them come back and say, well, we didn't really understand that, and now that we see the second review, we could have addressed that. So I'm very open to being contacted if people have questions or whatnot. In terms of things not to do, I would say do not argue with the reviewers about every little nitpicky point. Pick your battles carefully. Do not imply, either in your responses or in a letter to the editor, that your reviewers are clueless or unreasonable, even if they actually appear to be both clueless and unreasonable. Reviewers are doing their best job, and if they're failing to see the good ideas or the contribution in your paper, that can be partially driven by them, but it's probably partially driven by you. At least that's been my experience as an author, that most of the time when I get really frustrated and upset with reviewers because I feel like they're making silly suggestions or unreasonable suggestions, I take a deep breath, I step away from the paper, I come back, and I realize they made that suggestion for a reason. I mean, these reviewers are smart people, and they're doing this as a service to our field. They're not doing it to be mean to me, and so they made that suggestion, even if it seems like a silly suggestion, for a reason. What did I say in my paper that compelled them to make that? And then I can go into the paper and make the changes that are required. Certainly do not ignore issues, especially issues that are emphasized by the editor. But in addition, you want to go through point by point. The editor should give you some counsel and guidance as to which issues are the primary ones that you want to pay attention to. I think but that doesn't imply that you shouldn't also go through and look at the less important ones, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So respond to everything, but put most of your energy into the ones that the editor kind of points out to you or encourages you to focus on. I would say do not get particularly comfortable using the phrase that the reviewer's suggestion fell outside the scope of the current study. I have found that reviewers don't necessarily, and editors don't necessarily like that phrase, because then the response that I'll oftentimes get is, well, maybe you should have redefine the scope of your study so as to accommodate that. Again, you want to just be careful. Pick the battles that you want to push back on, and a lot of the suggestions can be really helpful. Get those incorporated into the paper. When it comes to a rejection decision, I agree 100% with Aaron. You want to incorporate the counsel that you got from your editor and your reviewers, even though they rejected the paper. It's a small world, and you would be surprised how frequently I'll get asked to review the same paper at more than one journal, or I might send a paper out for review as the editor at Organizational Research Methods, and a reviewer will respond, I'm happy to look at this, but I just wanted to disclose that I looked at this for another journal. I actually, as an editor, I love reviewers like that, because they've already seen the paper. They've already had their 2 cents in on it. And for whatever reason, it wasn't published at the other journal. But now, I'll know as an editor, are these authors serious? Are they going to take the feedback that they got at the previous place and incorporate it? Or are they just going to ignore what they were recommended and just go forward with the same paper? Obviously, I would say you also probably do not want to appeal every decision. If your paper was rejected, it was rejected for a reason. I have appealed a handful of decisions, a small handful, 3 or 4 papers probably, in my career. I have had very, very mixed success on that. I would say probably about half the time that I've appealed a decision, the editor approved the appeal and said, sure, we'll give you an R&R on it. Go for it. The other half the time, I would say that when I've appealed a decision, they've just said, no, we're going to stand by our decision. I have found that, personally at least, that going back to an editor and saying, I disagree with these reviewer points, and we could address these things here, that tends to be relatively unpersuasive. At least for me, it's been unpersuasive. Trying to convince editors to reverse a decision. Because it comes across, I think, as argumentative, and I think typically a paper is rejected because it doesn't make a contribution. In the final analysis, it's either rejected because there's some fatal flaw methodologically or analytically, or it just doesn't tell a compelling story. And so lots of times early in my career, I would look at these papers and I would think, I can address all of these concerns. And then I would talk to my advisor, and he's like, yeah, but the fundamental concern is that the contribution isn't big enough. And these little methodological issues that you say you can handle very easily isn't going to get the paper as above that threshold for publication. And so I think, again, you want to pick your battles. What I personally have found is that if you can go back to an editor and say, we agree with all of the reviews and we agree with the decision, but we have additional data that we were not planning to include with this data set, but we could merge them and we could have 2 data sets, and we could address, the contribution is as noted by the reviewer, is limited, and if our paper had done A, B, and C, it would be a great paper. Well, lo and behold, we actually have another data set where we do A, B, and C that we could combine with this. And so I have found when you have data and you can make a case that you can expand the contribution through that data, that editors tend to be a little bit more open to it. Last few suggestions, and these were just things that have kind of worked for me over the years. They may or may not work for you. One of the things that I do when I get an R&R, probably the first thing I do is I sit down and I write my response letter. I write my response letter before I've even touched the paper, because my response to the reviews is my roadmap. And so I have found if I can sit down and write my responses and think through how I'm going to deal with every single issue, whether it's a small issue or a big issue, and I can write it out and get it down on paper, then I have a roadmap for that revision. And for me, at least, that's been helpful. One of the other suggestions that I had from my advisor when I was starting out was basically swap papers with a colleague, somebody that's about in your same cohort. They do not need to be an expert on your topic. They don't need to be a collaborator. They just need to be somebody who's smart and whose opinion you respect and who will agree to turn around a peer review on a paper for you like in a week, super quick. And then you should do the same thing for them. And what you'll find is as you get more experience having someone else critique your ideas and you start to critique other people's ideas, you start to get better at critiquing your own ideas and recognizing how to frame things so as to preempt the criticisms that you might be getting. I really don't enjoy reviewing, but I will say that reviewing for journals really, really helped me, especially with the next point, which is focusing on the framing of my ideas. I really struggled as an author early on to do a good job of making the case for why anyone other than myself should care about the article that I had just written. And as I started to do more reviews for journals, I was able to really watch how that framing process unfolded at different journals with different authors. And so I have found that process to be very, very helpful. But the main thing is you want to just, hit the reviewers over the head with the contribution. Here's the contribution. Here's what I'm doing, and frame your manuscript around that. And then obviously be persistent. There's a lot of papers that get submitted. Many of them get rejected, but many of them get published. And I think, when you knock out the 30% desk rejection rate that I've got, and if you're able to get off of that, off the desk and out for review, and now I'm accepting 15% of the 70% that goes out for review, you're not really looking at a 15% acceptance rate once you get off my desk. Once you get off the desk, your acceptance rate goes way up. And so really work hard on the front end and framing your ideas and making sure it's a good fit with the journal. So that's my talk. If people have questions, I'd be happy to answer some questions, or we can turn it over to Elaine. If you think of questions later, you're always welcome to shoot me an email or give me a call.
At this
Thanks.
point, given that we only have 15 minutes remaining in this session, it would be great if we could turn it over to Elaine. I understand Elaine's might still be having some technical difficulties, but we are going to try and give it a whirl and see if we can't accomplish this task.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, it shows that my mic is on. Can people hear, just to make sure that I know? Great, okay. All righty, I'm going to just give a very brief talk, and a lot of the points that I had planned to make have already been mentioned by the other folks who spoke today. And so I'm going to try to tilt this a little bit to responding to reviewers for qualitative papers, because hopefully some of you are interested in that as well. Okay, so let me go ahead and progress here. As Chris mentioned, I've been an AE for AMJ for the past 3 years, and I'm responsible for qualitative papers. And so some of what I'm presenting is based on that perspective, from having looked at qualitative papers over a period of time at AMJ. And here are some statistics similar to what I believe maybe James gave earlier on the estimates of acceptances at AMJ. So currently, qualitative papers are about almost 18% of the papers that are accepted at AMJ. We too have a 35% desk reject rate. Another thing that we do at AMJ is we have a desk edit, and that is is a little bit better than a desk reject, but it really sends a message that you'd have to make a substantial revision if you would like your paper to be reviewed at AMJ. So a fair amount of papers are also desk edited, and I didn't put the percentage up there. About a quarter are given revise and resubmit invitations, and then 50% get a second invitation. So our acceptance rate overall is about 8%. Okay, so here are just some brief suggestions. I really only have 2 slides. I really hope we have some time for your questions for all the presenters. So I'm going to go through these. At least 2 or 3 people today have mentioned friendly reviews and the importance of getting feedback on your work. And that's really important also for another reason. I think it signals to the editor which domain or research stream your work falls into, and it also shows diligence in preparing your paper. We do at AMJ have an option to suggest an action editor and reviewers. When I get suggestions, I take them really seriously and usually try to make at least one of the 3 reviewers one that the author has suggested. You know, it can backfire too. I mean, sometimes you think somebody will be a great reviewer and it ends up backfiring. So you want somebody who clearly knows the area and is somebody who has done reviewing but hasn't seen your paper. And I think those are good criteria. You want to, of course, be responsive to the points the action editor has made in the letter. And, you know, that the action editor has done some prioritizing in order to write better. And so, and that person is also the final arbiter of the paper. So it's really important to be responsive to the action editor and address each point. I also would say you need to address all points by reviewers. As was mentioned earlier, I don't think you necessarily have to change things that are wrong if a reviewer has it wrong, but I think you need to address each point with an explanation. Another thing I'd point out, especially with qualitative papers, is to try to be concise. If reviewers get a 100-page document as a revise and resubmit, which sometimes happens with qualitative papers, they can get very fatigued. And so you really want to be concise and clear. We've already talked about keeping the tone positive. I actually have a co-author who asks me to edit his response to reviewers for tone because it's sometimes difficult to see it in your own writing. There may be a really subtle undertone of negativity, and so you want to make sure you avoid that. Another thing with qualitative papers is you don't want to assume all the reviewers will be familiar with qualitative methods. We do have a lot of reviewers right now at AMJ who do qualitative work, but it's sometimes rare to get 3 qualitative reviewers on a paper, and so it's important to be clear and transparent with your method. Okay, and the last slide here, as I just said, be transparent in describing your method and giving citations to support the method that you're using. A lot of people are describing their work increasingly as grounded theory or any other method, and they kind of cherry pick different parts of the method, and that doesn't work well with reviewers who are well versed in qualitative methods. So make sure, for example, using grounded theory, you mention things like theoretical sampling or theoretical saturation. Don't expect that the reviewers will know that you've done that or assume that you've done that. It should be very, very transparent. Another thing that may have been mentioned, and I did have a bad connection today, so it went in and out, but try to avoid relying on gap spotting to establish the importance of your work. You know, statements like, well, no one has studied this before. Well, there are a lot of things that haven't been studied, and so it's really important to establish the merit of your work on its own, not just the fact that it's filling a gap. In qualitative research, it's really important to make it clear how you moved from your data to your theorizing. And there are some great exemplars out there of people who do this well. And if anybody has a question, I'm happy to respond to that. I didn't include citations. I do know, though, there's one Spencer Harrison and Bess Rouse have got a great paper in AMJ in 2014. And it's called Let's Dance. And they really do a great job illustrating that movement from data to theorizing. It makes it very clear to reviewers who may not be familiar with qualitative methods. And again, as we've said over and over again today, make sure your contributions are crystal clear and do that early in the paper. They may be clear to you, they may not be clear to the reviewers and the people reading your paper. And then stay positive about the review process, and I hope you do submit qualitative work, if not to AMJ, to other journals. And I'm happy to answer any questions. We don't have a lot of time left. Or if Chris, if you want to open it up to broader questions, that's cool too.
Great. So at this point, I would like for you guys to, let's see if we can't ask questions of Elaine and James, although if you have questions of Jen or Aaron, they, I'm sure, are happy to answer those as well. And we have about 5 minutes for that.
Okay, I see people typing. I'm not sure. Okay. So I see one question. What is an interesting research question for you? I don't know if that's for the larger group or just for me, but I'll start the conversation. I think interesting research questions in terms of qualitative research are ones that are aimed at discovery. You want to try to come up with, I think a lot of interesting questions begin with the word how, for example, or why. So you're trying to understand a phenomenon versus trying to measure a phenomenon. So I'd say the most interesting questions are ones that are explorative. I'm going to turn my mic off just in case anyone else wants to respond.
I would just echo what Elaine said. I mean, I think they need to be research question. You know, just because somebody hasn't done something isn't a good enough reason to do it. There's a book called Opening the Black Box of Editorship, and one of the chapters in there is written by John Hollenbeck, and he was reflecting on his time as an author and as a reviewer and as an editor. And part of what he talks about is different ways that a research problem can be structured or framed. And, you know, his arguments were that having a paper that is going to be very influential and it's going to get a lot of attention starts with the idea, and the idea has got to be a good idea. And so what is a good idea? It's one that really changes the way people think about things. And not every idea is going to do that. Not every paper is going to be a citation classic. But as an editor, I'm looking for papers that I hope are going to be citation classics and that are going to be influential and are going to help people do better research and change the way they think about things. So it's not enough that something hasn't been done. It's got to be that something hasn't been done and there's a compelling reason to do it, and it's going to improve our understanding of what we're trying to study. So there's another question. What characteristics do you look for in potential assistant or associate editors? Or as I'd like to develop towards an editor role, what areas would you suggest that I focus upon? I would say I think the biggest suggestion that I would have would be doing really constructive and helpful reviews, and reviewers that are really helpful and constructive and on time, they tend to be the ones that are invited to serve as associate editors in the future. So I think being constructive and helpful, but being critical with an eye towards, critiquing papers and trying to improve the quality of scholarship is what is looked for in most editor-type roles. Someone else may want to chime in as well.
This is Chris here. I'll just add that I'm not sure how often you get asked to be an associate editor if you weren't considered a great reviewer. So probably the most fundamental thing you've got to work on is becoming a great reviewer. And so I had written that after you review, you should ask for feedback from the associate editor, and pay close attention to how your responses get used in the associate editor's letter. And then lastly, at some journals, you can ask for your rating, assuming that you've reviewed for them multiple times. The associate editor usually reviews each reviewer after a decision letter is completed, and so assuming that associate editor could be, their identity could not be given away, then you should ask for that rating. Well, at this point, we are at a little bit after the 5 o'clock hour, so we should probably wrap this up. I want to thank, and if you guys would join me in thanking our 4 fabulous presenters today, especially, and also thank them for their tremendous patience in working through all of our technical difficulties today. Thanks, of course, also to Davis, who helped us out with those technical difficulties and made sure that this happened. I want to let you know again that I will hopefully see you at the Academy of Management Conference at our social hour, and you should be expecting to get an email from me in the next few days where I'll be asking you to provide us with some feedback about these sessions. So thanks so much, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your summer.